any time that we have endangered species on an allotment that we're embarking upon a NEPA project in, there's a level of complexity that gets raised. And so when you do have those species, there's a likelihood you're going to have consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service. And with that, there's other roles and responsibilities for that permit holder. For the Forest Service, we have a guide for permittees for NEPA and for ESA. And it's for the Southwest region here. So any forest permit holders, I suggest anybody get this from their local rangeland management specialist. As far as management goes, is that there's often many cases where you can have a species of concern in ESA and grazing happening in the same place, the same time, with little impact to each other. Then there's obviously other times where you have to do mitigation measures, but there's also times where we can actually do things in management to help recover species. And so those are the things where that relationship thing that is so important between the rancher and the agency comes in. They need to craft a relationship with their local biologist, along with the state Game and Fish Department usually, and they can, from that relationship, do things that will benefit both livestock and that species to recover. So that, again, relationship comes in to be able to go ahead and make a successful natural resource situation.
Example of that was a few years ago when the southwestern royal flycatcher was identified along the Verde, and Verde was critical habitat for the flycatcher. We had one particular pasture that ran right to the river, and what we did is before the flycatcher came along, for grazing practices, we used to graze the river system year-round, and then as time moved along, we found out that the best thing to do is to graze the river pasture during the dormant season, allow the grasses an opportunity to regenerate and grow during the summer. So we went from year-round grazing to part-time grazing, seasonal grazing, wintertime dormant use only, and then the flycatcher came along, and one particular pasture, we did not graze in one pasture in February, March, and April for 90 days because that was a nesting time period for the southwestern royal flycatcher. So we made arrangements, we reconfigured our grazing schedule, and so we made that work. And we did that for a period of about probably 8, 9 years, maybe 10 years. When you talk about threatened and endangered species, number one, no one more than the rancher wants to embrace, encourage, develop, promote those populations. Yet on the other hand, the operations of a ranch, wherever that ranch may be, that impacts that ranching operation. And sometimes it's an adverse impact that creates consequences that really affects the bottom line of the ranch. So, you know, it's a balance, it's a give and take. I think what I'm trying to say is, yes, the ranchers want to work to encourage, to sustain that particular species, whatever species that is. Yet on the other hand, the agencies need to understand the constraints of a particular ranching operation, that we have constraints that we must work by. Number one, it has to be an economical viable unit. And we can make decisions about all these things we want to do or shouldn't do, but the bottom line is the rancher has to make some money to sustain his family. And that's the important part, and then we can start doing some of these other things. So yes, teeny species are very important. Those of us in the business, we want to continue to promote those species. Yet on the other hand, I think a lot of things that we've seen occur over the past, if not personally on our ranch, but other ranches, sometimes it causes an adverse impact. And a lot of times those people who make a living off the land don't see a financial incentive to help promote, to save the species. And the incentive is always more of a punitive situation than something that's an incentive to encourage, foster, develop of the habitat, to encourage and promote that particular species.
Threatened and endangered species play a huge role in our management of our ranches. I'll give you an example. About 7 or 8 years ago, at an Arizona Cattle Growers Convention, Society for Range Management conducted a survey. And it was, that survey was made up by ranchers and agency people. We asked the ranchers, what are the biggest challenges facing you today on your ranch? The number one challenge was drought. But the number two challenge was the Endangered Species Act and threatened and endangered species. When we delved into their answers and talked with some of these people, the issue was not a problem with the Endangered Species Act itself, but it was the way that some of that act was being implemented and actually used in somewhat nefarious manner, if you will. So it is a very important facet of ranching today. When you go out to do any type of project, you have to consider the threatened and endangered species. I can see how we have tremendous influence on those species. Our cattle out there, if they're eroding the stream banks, for example, if they're soiling the water where there's a certain spiked dace type of fish or an endangered fish or species, if you're out there doing a lot of work during the breeding season for the Mexican spotted owl, it can be a problem. However, here's what we find. I know a rancher that had 5 miles of fence to build along a road, and the rancher could not build that fence until November 1st, and he had to be finished with the fence by April 1st. And he had to do that in snow that was probably 3 feet deep. He couldn't go out and build during the spring, summer, or fall. However, along that road during the spring, summer, and fall could be any motorcycle, any ATV, anybody with a shotgun who wanted to go target shooting and so forth. So the implementation of the act, that rancher did not feel it was fair. That why could that go on and all that activity, but he couldn't build the fence during a decent time of the year. There's not a rancher I know who does not appreciate the wildlife that we have in the state of Arizona. And that goes for all the way from elk and the hunters all the way down to the Chiricahua leopard frog or the narrow-headed garter snake. That's not a problem with that. In most cases, when there's an issue with ESA and you need to establish viable populations of frogs or fish or whatever and to protect their habitat, ranchers will go out of their way to rotate their cattle at the appropriate times of the year away from those areas. They will take all kinds of measures as long as the Endangered Species Act is applied equally and fairly to everybody. So they don't want to feel that they're being almost discriminated upon, that they can't do certain things when the general public can. But as I mentioned with that survey, it affects many, many of the ranches here in Arizona. And if it's implemented properly, there is no issue. If any rancher would not have a problem with fencing off part of his dirt tank so that the wildlife and the frog can exist, as long as his cattle will still have access. Here on the Tonto, I've been to many meetings where ranchers have encouraged people, the wildlife people from Fish and Wildlife Service and Game and Fish, encouraged them to bring, I'll use again the example of the Chiricahua leopard frog. It was mandated that we have 4 populations on a certain district. Well, as long as you don't have 4 populations, 4 viable populations, you're going to be under pressure to control your grazing and perhaps eliminate your grazing from certain waters and so forth. Once you get 4 or 5 or 6 or more populations, the problem goes away. So it's our attitude, bring as many frogs as you can, so we're not on the verge of extinction in that area for that species, and let them flourish. We can live with the frog in that case. We can live with the Mexican spotted owl and so forth. But let's do the implementation in a proper and fair and just manner, and everything can coexist. We've learned that essentially now that there's not an issue with the Chiricahua leopard frog, that they do very well. Same thing with the desert tortoise when we worked on that issue. But if you were to ask a rancher, yes, initially they'll say, oh no, I've got the willow flycatcher or something, woe is me. But if everybody can sit down and say, look, we can make this work, your cattle can still have, we don't need access to the entire stream. We need access to a very small portion of that stream for drinking water. And then everything can flourish, if you will, or go ahead and work in a cooperative fashion.
Threatened and endangered species on grazing allotments, that is the elephant in the room, of course. And of course they have to be addressed because those are codified under existing environmental laws, under NEPA. And anytime there's a species of concern, then you need to deal with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But one of the first things a rancher should do, should he or she be faced with an endangered species, is be involved from the very beginning. They should request applicant status so that they can be in on the meetings with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a legal right to do that and should make that a part of their plan to address this. And then as the agency biologist completes a biological assessment, then they should be on board with what's being summarized and make sure they understand what the issues are. If they have disagreement with some things, to make sure they bring that up. And then as a meeting is scheduled with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they should request to be in attendance so that they can provide input on the issues of concern. One thing that a rancher should become familiar with is the habitat needs for particular species. And if there are things that he or she can do with their management to help assist in having favorable habitat for endangered species. So that requires learning more about the species, talking to biologists, and making some sound decisions on what, if any, management alternatives can be practiced on the ground to favor a species.